Hey guys, welcome to the 6th part of creating 3D medieval boots. In this part we're gonna be creating the low poly of the clasps. So let's get our model inside Maya. And like a lot of times I like to start with a simple cube. So hit the 3 key to go into smooth mesh preview. And now with the smoothed mesh, we're gonna match this up to our little button. Once we have a good matchup, we're gonna convert the smooth mesh to actual polygons. And I'm just collapsing edges now, because I want to try to get the poly count as low as I can. And of course on the back side, that won't be seen, you can go lower with the poly count. And now let's give it a hard edge to fix the shading. And for the UVs, it's gonna be really simple. Just map it out. And the hard edge, make this to a seam. And then we can unfold it. And that's all. So here I'm trying to see if I can get a nice high poly, and I don't like it. So I'm just gonna make a new high poly. So just like we did before, I'm using a cube and I'm matching it up, and then I'm just gonna smooth it out. Now we're gonna group the low and high poly together. And we can move it to the other side. And we do this because we do not want to retopologize every single button. Now we can just duplicate the group and we have a low and high poly. So now let's start actually retopologizing the clasp. I'm just gonna use the retopology tools, as this will be more complicated if I started with a cube. You always want to think what's the fastest and easiest way to doing something. So I'm just going over the whole model and I'm laying out my topology. We can select all the borders and extrude the edge out to give it thickness. Now we're just gonna bridge everything, so everything is capped. But first we gotta make sure everything lines up properly. So now that everything's lined up properly, I'm gonna start bridging everything. When I have everything retoped, I like to smooth shade all and then just place my hard edges. For part 2 we're gonna start the UVs, and like always, I'm just gonna press my button that will select all the hard edges, and I'm gonna convert them to seams, and this is gonna be my base for doing the UVs. So from there on I'm just gonna select all the parts and I'm gonna unfold them. I'm gonna see where I need to put extra seams, so it will look nice. Again, I'm just checking with the checker if there's too much stretching and if my UVs are all facing the same direction. And I'm just adding an extra loop and a bevel to help the shading. And now I'm going over my model and I'm trying to collapse as many edges as I can, as I want to get the poly count as low as possible. And here you can see that looking pretty weird, but it's okay, because this part is gonna be covered up by the boot itself. When you don't see it, you can save a lot of poly count. But I think in the end I decided to go back to just having a nice clean topology with a bit more poly count, as it doesn't really matter, because it's just gonna be a portfolio piece. But if you're doing this for production or your own game, you wanna make sure that you keep the poly count as low as possible. Up to part 3 of this video, and for this part we're gonna be duplicating the thing that we just made. The reason why I'm making a lot of duplicates, before the bake is because I want to have each clasp and button have unique UVs. You could also have them all share the same UVs, but these are small things and they're just gonna fill up empty UV space, so it's better to just have some unique UVs. So I'm just going over the mirrored objects and I'm making sure the UVs are not messed up. So for the mirrored objects, I need to flip all the UVs. And now I'm just selecting and moving out all the UVs of the high polys. I messed this up early, I should have actually done this before. But now we can just select them all, move them out, so we can easily select the low polys and the high polys, and now we can separate them. So after separating, just call them low and high so you know which one is which. And I have to admit, my workflow was a little bit messy here. But eventually you want to have all the high polys on a separate object and all the low polys on a separate object. So now that we separated them all, I'm just gonna export them out, the low and the high polys. Now for part 4, we're gonna be filling up the empty space with the UVs that we just created. And this can be a bit of a tricky thing. You want to make the textile density as high as you can. You don't need to match it with the boots or the pants. Just go as high as you can, while you can still have the same textile density for all the clasps, while filling up all the empty space. And textile density is basically how much pixels your texture will have. Like this is a small object. So if I make the UVs really big, it's gonna have a lot of textile density. And you can see in the tab on the right, this textile density. If you select the UV island and you press get, it will tell you the textile density. So now Mama set, I'm just gonna make a new bake group and add the models. And the reason we split this up in bake groups is because you won't have any projection from one bake group to the other. And you can see I have a little bake error, so I'm gonna need to fix this. And like I said, my workflow was a little bit messy on this one. The best thing you can do is model one clasp out, export it and try to bake it and see if it bakes fine. And if it bakes fine, then you duplicate everything. But it's not too much of a problem, as it's a tiny little bake error. We can just go ahead and fix it for every single one that we did. For part 5, we're gonna be fixing the bake. So at this point I'm gonna apply the ambient occlusion that we baked out. This will just help you visualize some of the baking errors, and especially where the projection is messing up. So we do have some little black points, and this is because the offset is not big enough, so I'm gonna fix that. It's really easy, just crank the max offset up and we'll fix it. So now back in Maya we can reload the textures, just hit 5 and then 6 to reload it. And now you can see that they're gone. I'm also gonna add a little vertex here where the button is gonna sit eventually. This is important because you wanna have a vertex where you can do the skinning too. Part 6. As you can see, some of the topology is messed up, but it doesn't matter. We can just go ahead and fix it, and then we can rebake. When you're doing your low poly, eventually what you're doing is you're working a little bit on the topology, you're exporting it out and you bake, and you see what's working and what is not working. It's like a workflow of tweaking things, and it's not like you finish your low poly, you bake, and then your low poly is done. You're always moving back and forward between bake and low poly. So I'm just twisting my UVs a little bit to get a better directionality. And we can check the directionality by looking to the arrows. And finally, part 7. This is gonna be the last step of doing the bake. We're gonna be painting the offset. This will be the final fixes. So you're just gonna spin around your model and see where you have some baking errors. And if you have a baking error, we're just gonna paint it with the offset. One thing that's important to know, you gotta know if your baking error is coming from a topology error, or a shading error, or a UV error, or if it's actually the projection. If it's a projection error, then we can get it out with painting the offset. I can't go in too far about knowing what kind of error it is, as it's just complicated and you're gonna learn by doing it. You're gonna start recognizing your bake errors. Eventually you can see an error and say, oh, this is because of my UVs, or this is because of the projection, or whatever. But maybe I'll make a future video about baking errors, because it's important to know how to fix them, and we all have them, and it's just an annoying little thing to deal with. So yeah, I'm always coming back to Maya to check out my bake, because I don't like to see my bake in Marmoset. Seeing it in Maya just helps me see it better, but you can check it wherever you want. Also, just to note, you don't need to fix all baking errors in Marmoset or Maya in your low. You can also get away with painting some baking errors away in Photoshop, but you wanna try to get your bake as nice and clean as possible, but sometimes it's just not possible to get it perfect, or it will take too much time. Like, you can spend 30 minutes trying to fix a bake error inside Marmoset, or you can spend 10 seconds in Photoshop. So you gotta decide for yourself if the effort is worth the time that you're putting in. I do also like to bake out my ID map and check it out in Maya, and this is just gonna show you the final baking errors really clear, as it's gonna be a color change. And sometimes baking errors can also come from your high, so you want to go back all the way to ZBrush and fix your mesh there. And now for the final part of finishing our low poly, we're just gonna be placing our clasps around. And this is definitely my favorite part of doing low polys, because now you know everything is finished, my bake is okay, my topology is done, my UVs are done. I just need to place some parts. And it's good practice to have like a group inside Maya. That's your baking folder, and they don't have them placed, so you can always go back and bake again. Then you have like a different folder where you have everything placed into place as your final low. Little projection error here, I'm just gonna paint it out like we did earlier. And yeah, that's it. Now we have a low poly done. And in the next part we're gonna be moving on to texturing, which is gonna be fun. And if you made it this far to the series, you're amazing, man. Because doing this stuff is kinda boring, the low poly, right? But see you in the next one.